We want to pick up where we left off the last time, and that was looking at the roots of America's participation in foreign affairs. Or, another way of putting it, we were looking at the roots of the evolution of a distinct, a coherent, a clearly identifiable American foreign policy. And those roots, in a general way, were those factors that we talked about, those factors that really came to influence American foreign policy, America's participation in the world. And they were the need for surplus markets, by way of recapitulation. With the American economy on an unprecedented growth, it needed, for the first time now, to be able to export domestic products. It needed to find overseas markets. And let me also point out at the same time that it was not just America. As we get closer toward the end of the 19th century, there is a keen and intense competition among both the European and the Asian powers in the world for the domination and control of foreign markets. That's important. That this intense, this keen competition will also influence America's decisions that it will make in foreign policy. That if they are going, every country assumes that if they're going to be powerful, they must have strong economies. They must have, in some cases, overseas possessions to create that strong economic policy. Generally, America does not go down that route. It doesn't really have to, but we'll see other countries will have to set up shop on foreign possessions. So, the need for surplus markets. And there was this simple realization, even by those who were dyed-in-the-wool isolationists, that it was hard not to recognize that the world really had physically gotten smaller. With the great ships, one could truly travel around the world in a month. So, I mean, you couldn't live in this sort of fantasy that America could stay isolated. The world simply geographically had shrunk, and you had to be aware of that. You had to take those things into account. And then there was the important teachings of Alfred T. Mahan, sometimes called the high priest of naval power and naval technology. Extraordinarily well respected, both within the military and among national politicians. And that his basic premise, that if America is to be a powerful country and take its place among the other powerful countries in the world, it would have to imitate the example of Great Britain. It would have to have those two Siamese twins, one of coaling stations and overseas refueling stations, and a strong navy. A strong military navy to protect a growing maritime navy. And then you had an upsurge in American nationalism. There was a tremendous upsurge in pride in being an American. I mean, it was hard for Americans not to take pride that by the turn of the century, they had overtaken most of the countries in the world, if not all of them, in economic production. That America was indeed the country of the future, not the past. It was the new kid on the block, to be sure, but it was a kid that certainly was drinking its milk, and it was growing fast. They took pride in that. And as a result, you have this renewed, a renewed sense of manifest destiny. That Americans were destined not only as they had to expand from ocean to ocean, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but now internationally. And then that was the new imperialism that dominated forces in the world. This new imperialism often hid under moralistic slogans like the white man's burden, duty to civilize less fortunate people in far-flung nations. The truth is, this was a part of this intense economic competition. The need for new resources to fuel their economies, to support their growing militaries, was a cornerstone of this new imperialism. It is this new imperialism that will result, as we look at the turn of the century, it will be responsible for an incredible number of détentes, alliances, treaties among countries. It is one of these, it is this factor that Wilson will take note of later in his 14 points that he argues that will be a primary reason for World War I. This new imperialism, which is really complicated by a whole new set of alliances. The U.S. has to be aware of changes in the world. They have to be aware of changes in Europe and in the Far East. And clearly, I think, as I indicated as we left off, America was fortunate and well served by the Secretary of State at the turn of the century, John Hay. John Hay understood all the various factors that I have just alluded to. He understood that America could not sit on the sidelines and not take an active role in the world if American national interests were to be well served. And what was America's national interest? It was to be able to compete economically in a world that would not erect barriers, trade barriers, against America's potential economic penetration. Already by 1899, there were countries who really wanted to stifle and exclude American economic participation in the world market. And he understood that. We can see that already. I mean, we can see John Hay acting on his understanding of this new world of the 20th century, as he will issue what becomes known as the Open Door Notes of 1899 and 1900. The Open Door Notes is an attempt by John Hay to indirectly establish a definite American foreign policy or a definite American posture in the world. In 1899, for instance, John Hay was aware that the Far East had become a veritable how do I want to put it? I want to put a time bomb in a way. Because what had happened in the Far East, that now you had a destabilization in the Far East. Beginning in 1894, with the defeat of China by the Japanese in the Sino-Japanese War, suddenly what was thought of as one of the most powerful countries in the world was now clearly simply a paper tiger. That China was simply a paper tiger. It was not a powerful country, as the Japanese very easily defeated the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War. And what were the consequences of the defeat of China? Well, immediately, because of the strategic location of China and of Manchuria, foreign countries wanted to be able to establish their own spheres of influence in China and Manchuria. Spheres of influence, that is, their presence, their physical presence in certain areas in China, from which they could control their own what? Economic policies. And what you see, well, countries like Germany, Russia, Japan, Italy, France, England, they were literally carving China up into their own respective spheres of influence. But not only were they carving China up and creating their own spheres of influence, but they were engaging in policies that were detrimental to America's economic interests. They were engaging in tariff policies in their spheres of influence that discriminated against American commerce. Ignoring, indeed, in the process, Chinese sovereignty. Ignoring the Chinese tariff duty laws that supposedly the Chinese were to collect their own tariffs. John Hay understood that this was a very dangerous precedent. And so he issued the first open door note in 1899. The note requested a reply. It was sent to the major players in the world at the time. It was sent first to England, Russia, and Germany. Later, notes would be sent to France, Italy, and Japan. The note asks them to respect the Chinese tariff treaty. To respect the Chinese tariff treaty. To allow the Chinese government to collect their own duties. And perhaps, secondly and most importantly, they asked all the countries with spheres of influence in China, they asked them not to discriminate in trade policies against individual countries. Now, obviously, who is he really thinking about here? He's thinking about these countries discriminating against America with their trade policies. So he asked two things. One, in the first open door note, he asked them to respect the Chinese tariff treaty, to allow the Chinese as a sovereign government to collect their own tariff duties. After all, I mean, that is a basic source of income for a country and undermines their ability to be a sovereign country. And secondly, as we see how American foreign policy and how it's intertwined and inseparably interrelated to economic growth and economic policy, it asks those countries with spheres of influence not to discriminate in economic policy against individual countries. That would only create friction, that would only create tension, and it would only create hostility between the various countries. This, I think, here again, this is a recognition by John Hay of what is happening not only in China, but what is happening in the world. It is a recognition of this intense economic competition that's taking place for power. Economic competition comes, and then military and political domination. Well, he requested that these countries reply. Most of them said, well, what is this with America, with John Hay? I mean, how dare the U.S. Issue a note to ask us to abide by these things. We're in the business of carving up this place. England, France, and some of the other countries will respond with qualified okays. Yes, we will. But they're all qualified. Nobody unequivocally says they're going to accept the first open door note. Russia, in fact, outright refuses to even respond. Then in 1900, John Hay is aware that things are not getting better in China, and that perhaps the U.S. had not made itself clear enough on China, and that perhaps we need to make ourselves a little bit clearer to those countries who perhaps misunderstood us. So in 1900, what happened is that there is a group in China, a group called the Boxers, a Chinese ultra-nationalist, fanatical group who hate foreigners, who want all foreigners out of China. It is a nationalist movement. The Boxers with these incredible chants, began to roam China, killing foreigners that they came into contact with. Became known as the Boxer Rebellion. Rebelling against foreign domination and foreign influence in China. Hating that the Chinese government was too weak to stand up against these outsiders. The Boxer Rebellion culminated in 1900. It culminated in Peking, China. It culminated in the Boxers surrounding all of the foreign legations in Peking, China. I guess legations, another word would be embassies. The foreign embassies. Because that's where all of the foreign legations were. They were in Peking, the capital of China, in China. In fact, they laid siege to the embassies. One was not sure whether they laid siege to make sure these people were simply, or hoping that they would simply vacate and leave China, or they would kill them when they left. The European countries and Japan now believe they had to act. They couldn't let the Boxers get away with this. So they decided on a joint expedition, a joint military expedition of 18,000 soldiers from the various countries to go into Peking, China, and relieve the foreign embassies. Well, John Hist said, whoa, would this not be a perfect opportunity for these countries to take advantage of this situation? Would they simply only go in and relieve the foreign embassies and leave as they had promised? The promise was the 18,000-man military expedition would free the embassies, and then the soldiers and their presence would leave honorably. But John Haidt says it would almost be too tempting that while they were there, would they not use that as an opportunity to exact even greater concessions now from a weaker China? Would it not be too irresistible while they were there not to exact greater concessions from China? John Haidt understood what he was. Yes.
When you say free the embassies, do you mean that there was people being held hostage in the embassies?
Exactly. They laid siege to it. The people couldn't get out. They were hostages. And as I indicated, one couldn't tell whether they were going to kill all of them if they came out, because they had murdered a considerable number of foreigners as they went on this rampage to get rid of the foreigners from China. So they were held up, they were trapped in their embassies, and the purpose was to free them. Okay. Now, yes.
Question. You said they would take over. This would be a great opportunity. We're speaking about Japan?
No, we're speaking about all of them. Japan, Russia, England, France, Germany. It would be an opportunity for all of them. Since they're already there, why not exact greater concession from the Chinese government, who is obviously weak? It can't even put the Boxers down. So why not, since you're there, exact greater concessions from the Prince Regent of China? I mean, what can he do? John Hay understood that and was right, especially in places like Manchuria. So John Hay said, we need to nip this right now. So John Hay issued the second open door note. This time, John Hay does not request a response. This is not a request. This is essentially an American declaration. Now, some people, as we will see, some historians have called it, he wrote the open door note with an impotent pen, but we'll see that, that actually John Hay understood, I think, what he was doing and the advantages that America had to be able to make a policy that perhaps militarily at this point they couldn't back up. Now, I'm kind of skipping ahead. Let me get a little excited here. Let me go back just for a second. The open door note in 1900. He doesn't request a response. He simply declares this, that America is committed to the political and territorial sovereignty of China. And that's a strong statement, is it not? That's a strong statement that America is committed to the political and territorial sovereignty of China. In other words, the U.S. is not going to allow China to be carved up by these foreign countries any further. And expected these European countries to respect what America called, what he called, an open door policy in China. That the European countries within their spheres of influence would not discriminate against foreign countries in terms of economic policies. It's not asking them now, it's telling them. Because in an open door policy, who benefits? The U.S. would benefit. The U.S.'s belief in its great economy, that in a free and open competition in the world, the U.S. would win any economic competition for markets and for dominance. And dominance, make no mistake, there's a correlation between economic dominance and political control of foreign countries or policies in those regions of the world. Yes? That's a good point. It is a declaration. It is, it's a bold statement. What would have happened if, that's why I made the point a moment ago that some historians called the declaration, it was written with an impotent pen. What would happen if the foreign country said, and if we don't, what are you going to do about it? What can you do about it? Because in truth, America certainly did not have the military to stand up against some of the other countries individually, but certainly not collectively. Indeed, the Americans, I should point out, but I want to point out too that how prescient people like John Hay are. We can criticize how they, were able to annex the Philippines. There was another way to have done that, but the way they did it, in the Boxer Rebellion was the first time already you saw the importance of having annexed the Philippines. American Marines, 2,500 of them, left the Philippines, were stationed in the Philippines, and went to Manchuria to participate in this 18,000-man expedition, and was able to get there in an incredibly short period of time because of being strategically located in the Philippines. But 2,500 is America's contribution. I mean, America did not have a military presence. And in fact, indeed, if those countries wanted to call the Americans bluff, if you call it a bluff, it is questionable, depending upon which country it was, how effectively the U.S. could have responded. But did John Hay simply issue a declaration without any thought to that? No. John Hay again understood the world in 1900. He understood the advantageous position of America in the world. He understood this, for instance. He understood that many of these countries were really at each other's throats. They were not friends. In fact, they were becoming, in some instances, bitter enemies. They were making these alliances and détentes against one another. They were getting involved in these entangling alliances. Let me give you an example. In 1902, you have the establishment of the Anglo-Japanese Alliance. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance in 1902, which was renewed in 1911. Well, this is a perfect example of what's happening at the turn of the century. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance was a treaty between Great Britain and Japan. Great Britain was not liked by most of the other countries, period. And Great Britain's military resources were being stretched globally. It was becoming more and more, it had just fought a bitter Boer War in 1899 in South Africa. The Boer War in South Africa. So the British military, Navy, was being stretched. It now needed to protect itself. That is why Great Britain was so happy that the U.S. fought the Spanish, because for them it was an indication that the U.S. was now ready to take an aggressive role in world leadership and world power. And maybe the U.S. could protect the Western Hemisphere from any encroachments by Europeans that would threaten Great Britain in the long term. And that's important, because that will dictate Britain's reaction to the open door note. So, but the Anglo-Japanese Alliance reflects these tensions that were beginning to build and would build and build until they exploded in 1914. Great Britain is worried that it may in fact be attacked. Japan is very aggressive. Japan wants to be a major player in the world too by 1902. It wants to play with the big boys in terms of foreign policy. It too is not liked. Particularly, it is an intense situation with Russia. Both have their designs on Manchuria. So let me, okay? Both have their designs on Manchuria. So the Japanese are really, as early as 1902, are looking to a confrontation somewhere down the road against Russia. So the Anglo-Japanese Alliance would do this. If Great Britain or Japan were attacked by one country, a fair fight, a one-on-one, then the other countries would stay out. Okay? They would not get involved. But what happens if Great Britain was ganged up on by two or more countries, then Japan was then obligated under the Anglo-Japanese alliance to come to the aid of Great Britain, and vice versa. If Japan were in a war between Japan and just Russia, on one-on-one, they would have to handle it themselves. But what if Russia, Germany, and some other country ganged up on Japan? Then Great Britain would have to come in and support them. See how you get caught up now? You see this, and this one alliance, in a sense, is just indicative of what was happening with countries throughout the first decade and a half of the 20th century. This rising series of entangling alliances of countries who are really in an aggressive a period of acquisitive advance. It's a hard word. A period of acquisitive advance. They were simply spreading out, seeking, eking out their spheres of influence around the world. Hay knew this. The only country that really was not involved in any entangling alliance happened to be the new kid on the block, a kid that was growing with such economic power that did you really want to anger the U.S. unless you had to? Did you really want to get the U.S. into a war? I mean, maybe you could beat them, but at some point, this country is going to be a valuable ally to some country. You would rather, I guess it's the old saying, they would rather have the U.S. in their bosom than on their back. Because America certainly potentially could become a formidable ally. And so none of the countries who could have responded, I mean, they, privately, they expressed outrage. I mean, who in the heck does John Hay think he is? Who those rustic upstart Americans think they are to tell us what we can and cannot do? Privately, they could do that, and they could spit and foam at the mouth. But publicly, they did not want to push the U.S. in the arms of one other country, of one country or another. So, because of that, because of the world situation, John Hay gambled that they would not challenge the open door note or the open door policy. And actually, no one does for that reason. No one wants to offend a potential powerful ally in America. So, based on that, the open door policy goes into effect. It becomes official. And America's foreign policy is the open door policy. Well, let's go back a little. Now, it's 1900. I want to look at a couple of things because there are two aspects of American foreign policy. One has to do with American foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere and American foreign policy in the Far East, both under Theodore Roosevelt. Well, as you can probably imagine, Roosevelt's foreign policy in many ways reflected Roosevelt's personality. I mean, what could we expect anything different? The first major issue that Roosevelt will face in terms of foreign policy will be the question of the building of the Panama Canal. Now, the history of the Panama Canal and America goes all the way back to 1879, and maybe even back even further. But let me state this as a general point, that most Americans always believed that someday they would be the ones who would sever the two continents. That they would be the ones who would sever the two continents and build a canal in the area of the world that we know today as Panama. That was always a dream of the Americans. In 1879, however, the Americans got sort of a scare when a Frenchman by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps, a 79-year-old energetic geriatric who had already gained international fame for building the Suez Canal. He had built the Suez Canal, and he now wanted his second great feat, and that was to sever the two continents and build a canal in the part of the world that we now know today as Panama. Now, you see, you notice I keep going back in the part of the world that we now know today as Panama, because at the time, Panama did not exist. In 1879, de Lesseps will create the French Canal Company, and he will secure a concession from the Colombian government. What is now Panama today at this time was a part of the country of Colombia. Well, de Lesseps was a wily, as I indicated, not only was he a builder, but he was also very wily and smart. He knew that that would be an outcry from the Americans when they found out that that the French country was trying to build a canal in that part of America, the Western Hemisphere. Would they be concerned that it would violate the Monroe Doctrine, which was declared in 1820, that there could be no further, that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further colonization, the entire Western Hemisphere? Would they react on the basis of the Monroe Doctrine? Would they simply react to this rising nationalism in America? Would they resent the idea? And they did resent it. Congress denounced it. But de Lesseps was smart enough that he wanted, and he engaged in an expensive public relations program to soften American opposition up. What he did was to create an American Board of Directory to explain their modest aims. Okay? On this American Board of Directory were some of America's most influential people, including the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and congressmen, bankers, newspaper people. I mean, it was a group of prestigious Americans who first sat down at Delmonico's restaurant, that famous restaurant in New York City. Over 600 people are actually a part of his American Board of Directory. Well, why did the Americans serve on it? He paid them. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy was paid $25,000. No small sum at this time in terms of real uninflated money. No small sum, $25,000, to serve on this Board of Directory. In fact, in total, De Lesseps spent $1.5 million on members of the board, the American Board of Directory. But it was too expensive. While he may have had great visions, he was a terrible bookkeeper. Two-thirds of the way through the excavation of the canal at the place that we now know as Panama, the French Canal Company collapsed for several reasons. One, the heat. Disease took a toll on the workers. The jungle, corruption. The treasurer of the French Canal Company decided that it was time for a vacation to South America. And since he was going to take a vacation, he might as well take most of the funds of the French Canal Company with him. So the canal company went bankrupt. And for the moment, Americans cheered as the canal company failed, because now the Americans still had the chance to build the canal themselves for America, for country, and for flag. Well, it didn't happen until Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt, as I indicated, was a president who really believed that America had to participate in the world. He was not an isolationist, he was an internationalist. He saw, and by the time he became president, this notion of American nationalism had become, particularly after defeating the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, Americans were absolutely crazy about being Americans. They could do anything. Now it was time to do something they had always dreamed about themselves, and that was to do what? To build their own canal. Roosevelt was swept up in the pulse of the American people. He knew what the American people wanted, and he announced that he would carry the canal dream through. So, he immediately convened a commission, the so-called Walker Commission. The Walker Commission examined the entire canal project and came up with several sites that were suitable for the U.S. building a canal. The most logical and ideal site, the Walker Commission reported, was the same site that the French Canal Company had begun to build the canal, and that was in the area called, we know today as, Panama. But it said a close second would be building a canal in Nicaragua. Now it may be a little bit longer, but not too much longer that it could not have been done or could not have been a top priority in case there was a reason they could not build it in the area of Panama. So we have those now. We have the Walker Commission reporting on two sites. But there were obstacles that stood in the way that had to be resolved before the U.S. could build a canal. Either, naturally they went first with the Panama area. One had to do with an old treaty with Great Britain. A treaty that was created in 1850 called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. In 1850, when Great Britain and America thought it was both beneficial to do this, they entered this treaty, which said essentially this. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. We could go into this forever. That neither the U.S. nor Great Britain could honorably, and underline the word honorably, could honorably build, hold, and fortify, and that means militarily, when it says fortify, and fortify a canal in this part of the world, or the isthmus, or the area of the Panama. Okay? That neither one could honorably construct or build, hold, and militarily fortify a canal in this part of the world. And the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty lasted until around 1901. But in 1901, that was this great excitement. The Americans now want a canal built. They have a president now who is committed to building the canal. There are senators who are saying, are you telling me we have to abide by an 1850 treaty with the English? You know, sometimes there was some cursing. You know, the hell with the Union Jack. We're going to build. This is our part of the world. We're going to build a canal. And John Hay said, tell the senators, again, we're in a very propitious position. I can negotiate a treaty that will lead to the abrogation of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. Give me a chance at it. Give me a shot at it. So Hay goes and he negotiates the so-called Hay-Pauncefoot Treaty of 1901. Actually, there were two versions of it. The first version, the American Senate said they weren't going to ratify it because the first version said that the U.S. now could build and hold the canal, but they could not militarily fortify it. The American Senate said, what? We can't put our guns there? You know, forget it. You know, again, let's just forget about it. Let's just, you know, the heck with the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. Let's go ahead and do what we want to do. And John Hay said, give me time. I'm sure I can get them to go all the way. John Hay knew that the English did not. The English wanted the Americans as allies and as friends. He knew the Americans were in a really good position. So he goes back, and he comes back with the final version, which is a complete abrogation of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which now results in the Hay-Pauncefoot Treaty of 1901, which gives the Americans, which totally abrogates the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, okay? It now says that the Americans can construct, they can hold, and they can fortify a canal in this part of the world. So you've got one stumbling block out of the way. The U.S. has honorably gotten out of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. Well, what is the next stumbling block that the U.S. has to face? Well, now you have to deal with the French Canal Company. Even though the French Canal Company went bankrupt and had not touched a shovel in that area of the world since 1879, practically, maybe 1881, they still had a concession to build the canal in that part of the world from Colombia. a concession that would not expire until 1904. Even though they weren't using it, it didn't mean that the U.S. could use it unless they did what? I mean, it's ours until 1904. Unless the U.S. paid us for the rest of our concession. So the U.S. will agree. I mean, this is free and good money. I mean, they have never gotten anything. The U.S. said, well, let's pay them. The U.S. agreed to pay this defunct company, which was never going to build a canal in this part of the world, $40 million. Okay, to get their concession. Huh? $40 million. Oh, the French Canal Company. Now, well, this should seem like it should be clear sailing. There's one other party to negotiate with, and that is the Colombian government. Well, John Hay was moving on that. And in 1903, things have moved this far. We only have about a year left. Now, keep in mind, you have only about a year left in 1903 to the French Canal Company's concession expires. This has a lot to do with what happens now. John Hay has the Colombian minister, Tomas Haran, in Washington. He is wined and dined. He is liberally given libation or alcohol. They are, and maybe too much alcohol, but in the end, on a good night, Tomas Haran agrees to a treaty. A treaty that is initially, now he makes this treaty without actually consulting the Colombian government, but initially the Colombian government seemed as though they're going to support the treaty, the Colombian Senate. The treaty would do this, the Hay-Haran Treaty. It would, one, the U.S. would give Colombia a lump sum of $10 million. They would renew a 6-mile wide canal zone for $250,000 a year. Okay, they would give them a lump sum of $10 million, and for a canal zone of a 6-mile wide canal zone, they would pay the Colombians $250,000 a year for their lease. This lease could be renewed in perpetuity. Now, perpetuity, what does that mean? Perpetuity means that forever if the U.S. wants. Well, all of a sudden, the government in Bogota had reservations about this treaty. They said, in perpetuity, we're giving away, because once the canal zone would have also given the U.S. extraordinary territorial rights, which meant that actually, for all practical purposes, that canal zone was a part of American soil. The Colombian Senate said, wait a minute, we're giving away a natural resource too easily. I mean, what about our rights and our sovereignty? What about the $40 million they're giving the French Canal Company, and they only want to give us $10 million? Most scholars really believe that the Colombian government would have, and in fact, they knew that in 1 year, the French Canal Company's concession would have expired. And then what would have happened? It would have reverted back to Colombia, and then the U.S. would have paid Colombia the $40 million for their concession. It's a lot more than $10 million. Only a year. The U.S. could simply waited. And so the Senate decides to set this treaty aside. Even though they initially said they would support it, they had second thoughts. Roosevelt is absolutely, when he hears about this, he goes nuts. He says that he will not allow this contemptible little republic, these wretched little creatures, from standing in the way of America's highway to civilization. He wants the canal. So strange things now begin to happen. There is a meeting in room, I think it was 1160, in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. There, a group of Colombian dissidents. Well, you know, you can find dissidents in every country. So you have a group of Colombian dissidents who are meeting with American officials who are discussing a spontaneous revolution for freedom. Well, if you discuss it, it can't be spontaneous. They actually plan a revolution in Colombia. Not in Colombia, in the area where the Panama Canal is. These people who are concerned with independence, these liberators, get assurance from the American government that if a spontaneous revolution breaks out, it just breaks out somehow, the U.S. would do several things. One, that under an 1846 treaty with Colombia, the treaty gave the Americans the right, well, actually, the Americans had to be requested by Colombia. It gave them, well, they had to be, technically they were supposed to be asked, but the upshot of it is that the U.S. was supposed to guarantee that this area that becomes the Panama Canal will always exist as a perfect neutrality. In other words, the U.S. is committed to not allowing any foreign country to come in and set up shop in the area that we now know as Panama today. That the U.S. will move in with troops to ensure the perfect neutrality of the isthmus, or this area that we know as Panama. But the key, like I said, is that generally the Colombian government will ask the Americans to come in if there's trouble. But the U.S. on its own decides when all of a sudden, well, let me get to the quick of it. All of a sudden, there is this spontaneous revolution. The USS Nashville has already left even before the revolution breaks out. I guess they called the Psyche hotline, and somebody told them that there was about to be a revolution, and so they need to be in this place. So the USS Nashville arrived, and it prevented the Colombian troops from moving against this handful of Panamanian revolutionaries. I mean, I think in total, this revolution cost the lives of one man and a mule. Wasn't exactly a big revolution, and within a day, Roosevelt was already recognizing this new republic of Panama. And a treaty within a couple of days was already headed to Washington, both recognizing the sovereignty of now a new country, Panama, and a new treaty regarding the canal. It becomes, so forget about the Hay-Haran Treaty. That was with the country of Colombia. Now we have a new treaty with the new country now of Panama. It is called the Hay-Varilla Treaty. The Hay-Varilla Treaty. The treaty does the same thing that the Hay-Haran Treaty does, except it's even more advantageous to the U.S. One, it will widen the 6-mile wide canal zone to a 10-mile wide canal zone. The U.S. will give them $10 million, a lump sum, as they have promised Colombia. The U.S. will be able to renew the canal zone for $250,000 a year, and they will be able to do it in perpetuity, and they will also exercise the rights of territorial exteriority, and that is, they will have extraordinary rights over the canal zone as a part of American soil. Well, the treaty is ratified. Colombia is absolutely what? So Colombia is just furious because they know that the U.S. was behind this. Over the years, the U.S. would try to soothe Colombia. In 1914, there will be a bill that will offer soothing balm to Colombia. They will offer them something like, I think it was $25 million to make them feel better about it. But the Senate will defeat it. By 1921, they will, again, ratify a treaty that will express, the reason that the Senate rejected the treaty that would have given them $25 billion is that the U.S. would have had to say with sincere regrets. Well, that would mean that they were admitted to what? Fomenting revolution. And they said, we're not saying we regret anything. We'll give them the money, but, and that's it. Let them go buy some, as Roosevelt referred to them as banana republics. Let them use the money to buy bananas or something, but that was it. Roosevelt was really rough on he called all the Latin American countries banana republics. As we'll see in a moment. Roosevelt had disdain for Latin American countries, and which creates real problems later on between the U.S. and Latin American countries. Well, the treaty is passed. The U.S. will, in fact, create this marvel that we know today as the Panama Canal. Now, the interesting thing is that the Panama Canal has just, after all that, the Panama Canal has just been turned back over to the Panamanian people because they came to resent the U.S. after they had after the country had been formed. And in a sense, the U.S. did it partly out of a sense to do what was right to the Panamanians, but part of it a big part was that by the end of the 20th century, it was clear that the Panama Canal could no longer handle the traffic that the U.S. needed. Most of the ships, in fact, were almost too big to even go through the Panama Canal. So in truth, the Panama Canal really becomes not a major factor in an age of global transportation, lightning ships and huge ships that can travel, at great speeds and great distances. It's not that much. It wasn't that big of a deal anymore. So partly out of morality and partly out of the fact that the canal really was not worth what it was in 1904. But by 1911, Roosevelt was being asked by reporters, Mr. President, all these reports about how we got the Panama Canal, don't you feel some remorse about violating international law and fomenting a revolution to get the Panama Canal? Roosevelt said, damn the law. I wanted the canal and I took it. Well, Roosevelt's attitude toward the Panama Canal, damn the law, I wanted the canal, I think reflects his view of Latin and South American countries at this time. And in some ways, his form of diplomacy in this part of the world has been referred to or dubbed cowboy diplomacy. Or a term, big stick diplomacy. You use either one you want, cowboy diplomacy or big stick diplomacy. The big stick diplomacy came because Roosevelt once believed in the African proverb of walk softly but carry a big stick. Okay? Now, so big stick diplomacy characterized Roosevelt's dealing with the Latin and South American countries. In fact, Roosevelt and most of Congress believed that these countries were a constant source of irritation to America. That these countries were involved in one revolution after another. That the countries had created one problem for America after another. For instance, in Cuba, let's look at Cuba first. In 1898, the Americans, when they went to war against Spain, wanted the world to know that they were not there to annex Cuba. They were not there to take over Cuban territory. To place the Spanish-American War on a high moral level, Congress passed the Teller Amendment in 1898 to reassure the world that they were not in it for territorial gain. The Teller Amendment said that the U.S. did not covet 1 inch of Cuban soil. They did not covet 1 inch of Cuban soil. In other words, they were not going to annex Cuba, and the Teller Amendment codified that into law. But by 1901, there were a number, including Roosevelt, who wished like heck they hadn't passed the Teller Amendment, because there had been one revolution in Cuba after another. Or as Roosevelt put it, these insurrectionary habits of these wretched little republics caused the U.S. all kinds of headaches. And that Cuba, because it was so close to America, they would have to find some way of getting around the Teller Amendment of 1898. They couldn't annex Cuba, but they could make Cuba a quasi-protectorate. That would be done through an amendment called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment of 1901, introduced by Orville Platt from Connecticut. The Platt Amendment would, for a while, solve the Cuban problem. It had a number of points. I think we will wait until we reconvene to look at the various points of the Platt Amendment and examine Roosevelt's Roosevelt corollary when we return.